The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the detonation of two atomic bombs over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on 6 and 9 August 1945 by the United States. The two bombings killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people, most of whom were civilians, and remain the only use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. Japan surrendered to the Allies on 15 August, 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan. The Japanese government signed the Instrument of Surrender on 2 September, effectively ending the war. Japan surrendered to the Allies on 15 August, 6 days after the Soviet Union's declaration of war and the bombing of Nagasaki. The Japanese government signed the Instrument of Surrender on 2 September, effectively ending the war. Chapter 1. Background. In 1945, the Pacific War between the Empire of Japan and the Allies entered its fourth year. Most Japanese military units fought fiercely, ensuring that the Allied victory would come at an enormous cost. The 1.25 million battle casualties incurred in total by the United States in World War II included both military personnel killed in action and wounded in action. Nearly 1 million of the casualties occurred during the last year of the war, from June 1944 to June 1945. In December 1944, American battle casualties hit an all-time monthly high of 88,000 as a result of the German Ardennes offensive. America's reserves of manpower were running out. Deferments for groups such as agricultural workers were tightened, and there was consideration of drafting women. At the same time, the public was becoming war-weary, and demanding that long-serving servicemen be sent home. In the Pacific, the Allies returned to the Philippines, recaptured Burma, and invaded Borneo. Offensives were undertaken to reduce the Japanese forces remaining in Bougainville, New Guinea and the Philippines. In April 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, where heavy fighting continued until June. Along the way, the ratio of Japanese to American casualties dropped from 5-1 in the Philippines to 2-1 on Okinawa. Although some Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner, most fought until they were killed or committed suicide. Nearly 99% of the 21,000 defenders of Iwo Jima were killed. Chapter 2. Preparations to invade Japan. Even before the surrender of Nazi Germany on 8 May 1945, plans were underway for the largest operation of the Pacific War, Operation Downfall, the Allied invasion of Japan. The operation had two parts, Operation Olympic and Operation Coronet. Set to begin in October 1945, Olympic involved a series of landings by the U.S. Sixth Army intended to capture the southern third of the southernmost main Japanese island, Kyushu. Operation Olympic was to be followed in March 1946 by Operation Coronet, the capture of the Kanto Plain, near Tokyo on the main Japanese island of Honshu by the U.S. 1st, 8th and 10th Armies, as well as a Commonwealth Corps made up of Australian, British and Canadian divisions. The target date was chosen to allow for Olympic to complete its objectives, for troops to be redeployed from Europe, and the Japanese winter to pass. Japan's geography made this invasion plan obvious to the Japanese. They were able to predict the Allied invasion plans accurately and thus adjust their defensive plan, Operation Ketsugo, accordingly. The Japanese planned an all-out defense of Kyushu, with little left in reserve for any subsequent defense operations. Most were immobile formations for coastal defense, but 16 were high-quality mobile divisions. In all, there were 2.3 million Japanese army troops prepared to defend the home islands, backed by a civilian militia of 28 million men and women. The Vice Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, predicted up to 20 million Japanese deaths. Chapter 3. Air raids on Japan. While the United States had developed plans for an air campaign against Japan prior to the Pacific War, the capture of Allied bases in the Western Pacific in the first weeks of the conflict meant that this offensive did not begin until mid-1944 when the long-ranged Boeing B-29 Superfortress became ready for use in combat. Operation Matterhorn involved India-based B-29s staging through bases around Chengdu in China to make a series of raids on strategic targets in Japan. Brigadier General Haywood S. Hansel determined that Guam, Tinian, and Saipan in the Mariana Islands would better serve as B-29 bases, but they were in Japanese hands. Strategies were shifted to accommodate the air war, and the islands were captured between June and August 1944. Air bases were developed, and B-29 operations commenced from the Marianas in October 1944. These bases were easily resupplied by cargo ships. The 21 Bomber Command began missions against Japan on the 18th of November 1944. The early attempts to bomb Japan from the Marianas proved just as ineffective as the China-based B-29s had been. Hansel continued the practice of conducting so-called high-altitude precision bombing, aimed at key industries and transportation networks, even after these tactics had not produced acceptable results. Chapter 4: Atomic Bomb Development. The discovery of nuclear fission by German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in 1938, and its theoretical explanation by Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, made the development of an atomic bomb a theoretical possibility. Fears that a German atomic bomb project would develop atomic weapons first, especially among scientists who were refugees from Nazi Germany and other fascist countries, were expressed in the Einstein-Szilard letter in 1939. This prompted preliminary research in the United States in late 1939. Progress was slow until the arrival of the British Maud Committee report in late 1941, which indicated that only 5 to 10 kilograms of isotopically enriched uranium-235 were needed for a bomb instead of tons of natural uranium and a neutron moderator like heavy water. The 1943 Quebec Agreement merged the nuclear weapons projects of the United Kingdom and Canada, Tube Alloys and the Montreal Laboratory, with the Manhattan Project, under the direction of Major General Leslie R. Groves, Jr., of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Groves appointed J. Robert Oppenheimer to organize and head the project's Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico, where bomb design work was carried out. Two types of bombs were eventually developed, both named by Robert Serber. Little Boy was a gun-type fission weapon that used uranium-235, a rare isotope of uranium separated at the Clinton Engineer Works at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The other, known as a Fat Man device, was a more powerful and efficient, but more complicated, implosion-type nuclear weapon that used plutonium created in nuclear reactors at Hanford, Washington. Chapter 5: Preparations. The 509th Composite Group was constituted on 9 December 1944, and activated on 17 December 1944, at Wendover Army Airfield, Utah, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets. Tibbets was assigned to organize and command a combat group to develop the means of delivering an atomic weapon against targets in Germany and Japan. Because the flying squadrons of the group consisted of both bomber and transport aircraft, the group was designated as a composite, rather than a bombardment unit. Working with the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, Tibbets selected Wendover for his training base over Great Bend, Kansas, and Mountain Home, Idaho, because of its remoteness. The Target Committee nominated 5 targets. Kokura, now Kitakyushu, the site of one of Japan's largest munitions plants. Hiroshima, an embarkation port and industrial center that was the site of a major military headquarters. Yokohama, an urban center for aircraft manufacture, machine tools, docks, electrical equipment and oil refineries. Niigata, a port with industrial facilities including steel and aluminum plants and an oil refinery. And Kyoto, a major industrial center. For several months, the U.S. had warned civilians of potential air raids by dropping more than 63 million leaflets across Japan. Many Japanese cities suffered terrible damage from aerial bombings. Some were as much as 97% destroyed. Chapter 6: Bombs. The Little Boy bomb, except for the uranium payload, was ready at the beginning of May 1945. There were 2 uranium-235 components, a hollow cylindrical projectile and a cylindrical target insert. The projectile was completed on the 15th of June, and the target insert on the 24th of July. The projectile and 8 bomb pre-assemblies, partly assembled bombs without the powder charge and fissile components, left Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, California, on the 16th of July aboard the cruiser USS Indianapolis, and arrived on Tinian on the 26th of July. The target insert followed by air on the 30th of July, accompanied by Commander Francis Birch from Project Alberta. The first plutonium core, along with its polonium-beryllium Urchin initiator, was transported in the custody of Project Alberta courier Remer Schreiber in a magnesium field carrying case designed for the purpose by Philip Morrison. Magnesium was chosen because it does not act as a neutron reflector. 3 Fat Man high-explosive pre-assemblies, designated F-31, F-32, and F-33, were picked up at Kirtland on 28 July by 3 B-29s, 2 from the 393d Bombardment Squadron plus 1 from the 216th Army Air Force Base Unit, and transported to North Field, arriving on 2 August. Chapter 7. Bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was the primary target of the first atomic bombing mission on 6 August, with Kokura and Nagasaki as alternative targets. The 393d Bombardment Squadron B-29 Enola Gay, named after Tibbets's mother and piloted by Tibbets, took off from North Field, Tinian, about 6 hours flight time from Japan. Enola Gay was accompanied by 2 other B-29s, the Great Artiste, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, which carried instrumentation, and a then nameless aircraft later called Necessary Evil, commanded by Captain George Marquardt. Necessary Evil was the photography aircraft. Due to crosswind, the bomb missed the aiming point, the Ioi Bridge, by approximately 240 meters, 800 feet, and detonated directly over Shima Surgical Clinic. 143. It released the equivalent energy of 16 plus or minus 2 kilotons of TNT, 66.9 plus or minus 8.4 terajoules. The weapon was considered very inefficient, with only 1.7% of its material fissioning. The radius of total destruction was about 1.6 kilometers, 1 mile, with resulting fires across 11 square kilometers, 4.4 square miles. At 3:47 Tinian time, GMT plus 10, 2:47 Japanese time on the morning of 9 August 1945, Boxcar, flown by Sweeney's crew, lifted off from Tinian Island with the Fat Man, with Kokura as the primary target and Nagasaki the secondary target. The mission plan for the second attack was nearly identical to that of the Hiroshima mission, with 2 B-29s flying an hour ahead as weather scouts and 2 additional B-29s in Sweeney's flight for instrumentation and photographic support of the mission. Sweeney took off with his weapon already armed but with the electrical safety plugs still engaged. During pre-flight inspection of Boxcar, the flight engineer notified Sweeney that an inoperative fuel transfer pump made it impossible to use 2,400 liters, 640 US gal, of fuel carried in a reserve tank. This fuel would still have to be carried all the way to Japan and back, consuming still more fuel. Replacing the pump would take hours. Moving the Fat Man to another aircraft might take just as long and was dangerous as well, as the bomb was live. At 11:01 Japanese time, a last-minute break in the clouds over Nagasaki allowed Boxcar's bombardier, Captain Kermit Behan, to visually sight the target as ordered. The Fat Man weapon, containing a core of about 5 kilograms 11 pounds of plutonium, was dropped over the city's industrial valley. It exploded 47 seconds later at 11:02 Japanese time at 5:03 plus or minus 10 meters, 1,650 plus or minus 33 feet, above a tennis court, halfway between the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works in the south and the Nagasaki Arsenal in the north. This was nearly 3 kilometers, 1.9 miles, northwest of the planned hypocenter. The blast was confined to the Urakami Valley and a major portion of the city was protected by the intervening hills. The resulting explosion released the equivalent energy of 21 plus or minus 2 knots, 87.9 plus or minus 8.4 terajoules. Big Stink spotted the explosion from 160 kilometers, 100 miles, away, and flew over to observe. Chapter 8. Surrender of Japan and subsequent occupation. On the 12th of August, the emperor informed the imperial family of his decision to surrender. One of his uncles, Prince Asaka, then asked whether the war would be continued if the Kokutai could not be preserved. Hirohito simply replied, "Of course." As the Allied terms seemed to leave intact the principle of the preservation of the throne, Hirohito recorded on the 14th of August his capitulation announcement, which was broadcast to the Japanese nation the next day despite an attempted military coup d'état by militarists opposed to the surrender. In his declaration's 5th paragraph, Hirohito solely mentions the duration of the conflict, and did not explicitly mention the Soviets as a factor for surrender. But now the war has lasted for nearly 4 years. The sixth paragraph by Hirohito specifically mentions the use of nuclear ordnance devices against Japan by the United States, from the aspect of the unprecedented damage they caused. Chapter 9, Post-Attack Casualties. An estimated 90,000 to 140,000 people in Hiroshima, up to 39% of the population, and 60,000 to 80,000 people in Nagasaki, up to 32% of the population, died in 1945, though the number which died immediately as a result of exposure to the blast, heat, or due to radiation, is unknown. One Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission report discusses 6,882 people examined in Hiroshima and 6,621 people examined in Nagasaki, who were largely within 2,000 meters, 6,600 feet, of the hypocenter, who suffered injuries from the blast and heat but died from complications frequently compounded by acute radiation syndrome, ARS, all within about 20 to 30 days.